What's up, 8th grade? It is Mr. Frazier. Today's history lecture is for Wednesday, March 25th. Now, we are not going to have a science lecture tomorrow because a lot of it is review, and we did all of our reading. So this will be the last lecture for the week. Remember to try and keep up with your required reading, and all of the stuff that I'm talking about is in your book. This is just some supplementary information. So if you are into it, cool. Hit that subscribe button, slam that bell, but if you're not, just keep up with your reading and do your homework. All right, so we were talking about medieval Europe. We talked about Alfred the Great and the Norman conquest, and England is unified under one king. Now, William the Conqueror does his census, the Domesday Book, and unifies the kingdom and makes it French. All of the people are still English, but because of feudalism, he is French, he speaks French, and he gives the land to all of his buddies, all of his homies who helped him at the Battle of Hastings. And so, the aristocracy, all of the dukes and counts and, marquises, all of the people who are wealthy are all French. And that is going to be an issue because when we talk about the 100 Years' War in a second, they're all related, or by marriage or by blood, and so they all kind of lay claim to each other's stuff, and that's going to be an issue. But we're going to talk about how England begins to change during the Middle Ages. Things are, kind of whoever is strong enough to take the stuff gets the stuff. So the Danes are strong enough to take the land, so they get land. The Normans are strong enough to take it from the Danes or the Anglo-Saxons, and they get it. And we will see that after 1000 AD that there is a more solidified, more structured England, and that you have these dynasties that start to last longer. Now, even though William's own sons and grandsons kind of have a rocky start, we get the beginning of the first kind of real English dynasty, the Plantagenets. Now, the word Plantagenet actually comes from a French word which means like a sprig of flowers, and it started by William's descendant, Henry II. And he's right there. And Henry II used to wear kind of like a sprig of flowers in his hair. I don't know, like trying to look cool. And so that's how they gave him the nickname. And the whole dynasty is named after the fact that this guy, wore some flowers in his hair to parties. But the Plantagenet dynasty lasts for a long, long time. Now, it's going to get a little confusing. The kings of England are not very creative. So there's not a lot of Aidens or, Quantes or all of the different names that we have today. There's a lot of Henry, William, Richard, and they just put numbers next to it. So if you have questions, you can text me. You can also look it up in the book. But there's like 3 Henrys that we're going to talk about today and 2 Richards. So try and keep them in order. This is the first Henry, but he's Henry II. And he's the founder of the Plantagenet dynasty. Now, who do we got after him? Boom. Now, English monarchy is different than other monarchies around the world. Now, when I say the word monarchy, obviously that means rule by one person. But in different countries and in different kingdoms, the kings or queens have different levels of power. So in the French kingdom, they have absolute monarchy. And the French kings, like Louis XIV, own everything, and the French people have very few rights. So the French king can just say, I'm taking this, and that's what he did. In fact, Louis XIV once famously said, you know, I am the state, meaning, I'm the government, I'm everything. But the English monarchy has limits, and that's what we're going to talk about right now. Henry II passed laws, and he gave English people certain rights, where it didn't matter if you were rich or poor, you all had the same rules, the same laws. And he did something that was kind of crazy for the time: trial by jury. Now, you may remember from the class, we talked about how in the past they would have trial by ordeal, where if you were accused of a crime, you would have to fight somebody to prove you're innocent, or reach your hand into the boiling water to pick up the stone, if you remember all that, right? And they were trying to see if God was saying you're innocent or guilty based on, random events. But that doesn't make any sense. And so trial by jury is kind of a big deal. If you're accused of a crime, then people are going to decide using their rational brains. And so it may seem like a small thing, but it's actually a huge, huge event that English citizens had, that not everybody else in Europe or around the world did. All right, so some other famous Plantagenets. You have Richard the Lion-Hearted. Now, you may remember from our chapter on the Crusades, Richard was the only English king to go on a crusade. He was a little late to the party. Richard, after it tried to reinforce the Crusader kingdoms in Jerusalem, and it didn't go so well. And on his way back, he was besieging a small French town, and he gets shot through the neck by a crossbow bolt. The story says it was a French chef who was, feeding the defenders on top of the castle wall, who shot a crossbow bolt, and it shoots, and it goes right through, kind of lucky shot, and hits Richard the First. Who knows? But when Richard dies, his younger brother, John the First, becomes king. Now, John was not supposed to be king because he was the younger brother, but Richard being shot in the throat and all, he becomes king. And John is so hated that even today we know him as a bad guy. So if you've ever heard of Robin Hood, if you've seen any movies or cartoons, the old Disney cartoon Robin Hood is a fox, Prince John is the bad guy, and Prince John becomes King John the First. And he is such a bad ruler that his own nobles rise up against him, and they fight. They fight against their king, which was kind of a big deal. Not only that, John is at the same time fighting King Philip II of France, and John's getting his butt kicked in France, and he can barely keep his own nobles in line. And so, to kind of save himself and save the kingdom, he is forced to sign the Magna Carta. You see a picture of it right there. The Magna Carta means the Great Charter. And you can think of it as kind of like a very early English constitution. It gives the English nobles more rights. Now, today in America, we have all kinds of rights: the freedom of speech, the right to bear arms, freedom of religion. Well, people didn't have that in the past. We talked about if you were the wrong kind of Christianity, you could be burned at the stake. So the Magna Carta is a really big deal. Now, John did not want to sign that. He was not happy about it at all. But, the barons kind of had him between a rock and a hard place. He was losing in France, he was losing all over the place, And so they forced him to sign the Magna Carta, and it's a very big deal. In 1215 AD, King John I signs the Magna Carta. But even then, he goes back on his word and tries to tear it up and say, I never meant it. And there's another civil war, and the whole thing just ends poorly, and then he dies, and everybody's happy he's gone. All right. Next, the 100 Years' War. So, we talked about this problem of English kings being French nobles, so the English kings were related to the kings of France. And when the kings of France had a dispute about who would be the next king of France, the kings of England said, "Hey, we're French. We should be the kings of France as well." And so there sparks off these wars that last for over 100 years, and it's crazy, crazy long. The English armies invade France, and for 100 years, English armies defeat French armies and conquer and take much of France. At one point, they have more of France than the French king. Um, they get huge victories, even when they're outnumbered, at the battles of Crécy, Poitiers, and Agincourt. They still make movies. There's Shakespearean plays about these battles. If you have seen on Netflix, they have the the show about the King, King Henry, with Timothy Chalamet. I think that's his name. Is about Henry V, one of the kings during the 100 Years' War. If you want to, do some extra credit about the 100 Years' War, let me know. Because it's very, very impressive. Well, how did they get all these victories? Well, because of the English longbows. The English lower classes had developed a long bow for shooting arrows, and they started practicing with them when they were very young. And so by the time that they were adults, many young English men could pull, drawing a bow. If you think about somebody shooting arrows, it looks easy, but it's very hard. And the bigger the bow, the longer it is, the harder it is to pull back, but the more force it has. So if you could pull back one of these English longbows, you could really fire an arrow far. And so English archers could shoot arrows that would go all the way through metal armor. And when all of the French knights would, come galloping at the English armies, they would just get absolutely, pincushioned by these English archers. Another famous part of the War of the 100 Years is Joan of Arc. She is a young French girl. She's like 14, 15 years old, and she claims to have a vision. She's just a common young person during the 100 Years' War, and she has a vision of the Virgin Mary. And in the vision, the Virgin Mary says that she needs to help the French army. And so she goes to see the king and, convinces him that she was sent by Virgin Mary. And she dresses up in armor, and she, leads, no, I don't know about leads, but she is with French troops in battles. She is wounded, very seriously wounded more than once. And she fights, and she's kind of so impressive that she rallies the French troops, and the French troops begin defeating the English armies. And the English are so upset with Joan of Arc that they, say she's a witch and that she's defeating English armies with her witch powers. And so they lay a trap. And as Joan of Arc is marching with her armies, they are surprised, and she's captured. And they say, demand, Joan, she's still just a young woman at this point. Joan, admit that you are a witch and repent, and we'll spare your life. And she won't do it. And so they burn her at the stake as a witch. and she goes defiantly and bravely to her death. And so all these years later, almost 1,000 years later, we still remember Joan of Arc, this young French girl who was so brave and fought so bravely and strongly. Anyways, Joan of Arc. All right, next we got, there's so much, this chapter has got so much stuff jam-packed into it. Next is the War of the Roses. So we got another civil war. It's called the War of the Roses because it's between the House of Lancaster and the House of York. The House of Lancaster was the royal house. If you've ever heard of like the Game of Thrones, they're the dynasty of the Lancastrians, and their symbol was the red rose of Lancaster. Their cousins, the nobles from the House of York, had a white rose, and so when they fought a civil war, it became known as the War of the Roses, the red Lancastrian rose versus the white House of York rose. And so if you were somebody who supported the Lancasters, you would either have a actual red rose, or you would paint a red rose on your shield or your armor. And they fought over 30 years. It starts because there's a weak king named Henry IV, who is not ruling the crown very well. He's not running the country very well. I'm not going to get into all the particulars, but some people think that maybe he was handicapped. Other people have said, slanderous things about him, and, who knows? We don't know these people as actual humans, but he did not do a very good job of running the country. And his cousin, the Duke of York, also named Henry, by the way, decides to fight him for it. And they get into a battle, into a war, and the throne goes from the House of York to the House of Lancaster, back to the House of York, back to the House of Lancaster, so on and so forth. And at the end of 30 years, they have this huge battle. It's the Battle of Bosworth Field. And it's between kind of the last two remaining Lancastrian and Yorkist nobles. Here's that is Henry IV, looking very fancy. As you can see, he's got his royal scepter and pearls and such. And it's very interesting. I wish I had more time to talk about all this. I'm not going to talk your ear off. But in the end, there is a guy named, I can't remember his name. Dang it, it'll come to me later. But the king dies, and he has two young sons. And they are 13 years old and 9 years old, respectively. But their uncle, Richard III, wants the throne. There's a very famous Shakespearean play between, it's called Richard III, and he is, this humpback, and he's sinister, and, all of these bad things. Now, we don't know how much of all this is true. We do know that Richard III became king, and that his two young nephews disappear. They're locked up in the Tower of London, and then they disappear. And people are kind of so upset that it's the last kind of phase of the War of the Roses, and there's this young noble named Henry Tudor, and he invades, and he fights Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field. And Richard III is killed. And when he's killed, they kind of, desecrate his body and just bury him in a hole. And this is all very interesting because there is a documentary where they look for Richard and they find his body, and he was buried underneath a parking lot behind a grocery store. As London had continued to expand, and they find his body. We're going to talk about it in a second. But when Henry Tudor defeats and kills Richard III, he becomes the new King of England, and he ceases to be Henry Tudor and becomes Henry VII. And he is the first Tudor king. And the Tudors are very, very famous English monarchs. Uh, this is a scene from a movie uh, about Richard III, and if you are thinking, hey, I know that guy in that picture, that is Benedict Cumberbatch, and he is also Doctor Strange in all of the Marvel movies, but he's a Shakespearean actor. Um, but Richard III is killed, and the Tudors become king. Now, you can see that Henry Tudor is holding a red rose, so we know that he is on um, the Lancastrian side. But the Tudors try to blend the houses of Tudor and York by making a red and white rose so that it's like unity again. So that is Henry VII. This is Richard III. I would strongly recommend watching that documentary. It's called like the Smithsonian Secrets. If you Google Richard III parking lot, you'll find it. And it is crazy interesting to think that people were just, you know, going grocery shopping and walking out to their car, walking over the body of Richard III's bones. And it's kind of this very interesting murder mystery. And, Richard III is a very interesting character because, on one hand, um, he's gotten such bad press. People called him like the hunchback, and the murderer. That some people think he's just got bad press. He is the rightful king, but on the other hand, what happened to his nephews? Anyways, I think all this stuff is crazy interesting. But when Henry VII becomes king and the Tudor dynasty reigns, we get all of the famous kings and queens and the Shakespearean plays, and Henry VII's son is the very famous Henry VIII. And Henry VIII loves the ladies and has a number of wives, and we'll talk about them next week. Anyways, I hope you guys are doing well. I know that this is just a lot coming at you. Do your best to keep up. If you have questions, let me know. Email me, text me, and hopefully I will see you soon. Have a wonderful day. Goodbye.